The good folks at Comics for Fun and Profit have been doing 2 episodes a week for quite some time now, and it's all thanks to, first of all, Jason, and second of all, our patrons who allow us to add the space on our server, broadcast more, store more, share more with you, the listeners. I'm envious of those of you who have unlimited storage and media server capabilities. We pay for ours here at the C4 FAP. It ain't cheap. We thank you so much for those of you who go to patreon.com/comicsfunprofit and contribute at any level to say thanks, to say, I want to be a part of your Slack channel conversations. I want to get exclusives. I want to get early access. I want to get ad-free access. I want to get swag. I want to get some free stuff. Whatever your reasoning is, we appreciate it at any level because it does make a difference. So from the bottom of Kyle and I and Jason's heart, thank you for contributing.
Aloha! This is Jason from Hawaii. Welcome to a very special edition of the Comics for Fun and Profit podcast. In this episode, I am welcoming back two friends of the show, Mr. Richard Arndt and Mr. Stephen Fears. Now, I have invited them back to talk about their very successful book, Our Artists at War, the best of the best American war comics by Tomorrow's Publishing. Now, Tomorrow's is spelled with T, it's TWOMORROWS. Again, it's Tomorrow's Publishing. Now, this book is available through the Tomorrow's website, on the Amazon website, in stock trades, or better yet, just order it from your local comic shop. Now, I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Steve?
I just wanted to add also Bud Plant Books.
That's right.
Yeah, he's
Bud's been a very good supporter of our efforts. So I'm
yes,
happy to promote him too.
Yes. And then when I start wrapping things up again, and again, it's I'm sorry, Bud Plants?
Yes.
Bud, BUD PLANT.
It's Bud Plant Art, I believe, on the internet.
Or art
Okay.
book, something like that.
Okay. All right.
Highly recommended.
If you're ever looking for something you've heard of and you don't know where to get it, Bud Plant's the guy to go to.
All right. Okay. Now, and then Richard and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong on this part. Now, the Our Artists at War book. This is a 160-page book that contains 8 chapters. The preface is written by Roy Thomas, and the foreword is written by Willie Franz, and the cover is done by the late Joe Kubert. Richard and Steve, welcome back to Comics for Fun and Profit. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing fine. Thank you very much.
Yes, same here.
All right. No, thanks, guys. Again, thank you very much for coming back on the show. Thank you very much.
Thank you for asking us.
Yes, that was nice of you.
So now, for listeners, I interviewed Richard and Steve last year, before the book came out. That was episode 674, and I just want to be clear, when I interviewed them last year, I forgot to ask for an advanced copy of that book before the interview. So, if you listen to that episode, it's kind of an origin story of how they came up with the book and so forth. So if you get a chance, please check out that interview. Now, for this interview, this is the one you really want to listen to. I've already already got the books, and I already told Richard and Steve that I picked some chapters, out of the 8 chapters, I picked some chapters that I read in detail, and I want to focus in on this interview. I also told Richard and Steve that, unfortunately, I didn't. There is a chapter on Sam Glasman's and the USS Stevens. I'm sorry, I didn't read that chapter, but and Richard, like I said, and Steve, if you guys want to talk about that chapter, that's perfectly fine. Don't worry about that. Again, I will ask Richard and Steve some questions on how they came up with the idea of the book, and then just jump ahead into the meat and potatoes of this incredible book. If you are a big time war comic book fan, this book features, the works of, and I'm just going to name a few creators: Harvey Kurtzman, John Severin, Joe Kubert, Sam Glasman, Robert Hanger, and Willie Franz. So, Richard and Steve, do you guys want to add anything to that before we start going through the questions?
Don't forget the king of comics, Jack Kirby's in here too.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Yes. Yes.
And Garth Ennis, if you like The Boys on
Yeah.
TV, or if you like Preacher, Garth Ennis has a big chapter in here, along with Don Lomax and Wayne Van Sant. So.
Yes, they're probably the three best current ones.
Yes. And later in the show, we'll be focusing a little bit on them as well too.
Good.
Okay. So actually, Richard, I'm going to start off with you. Where can listeners follow you on social media?
I'm sorry, what?
Where can listeners follow you on social media?
I have a Facebook page, but that's basically all I'm doing on social media myself.
Okay. All right. And then what about you, Steve?
I'm about the same. I have a Facebook page that occasionally I will visit it.
Okay. All right. All right. Now, before we start jumping into questions, I want to thank Richard. Richard, thank you very much. You sent me an email a few months ago about how well the book was doing. So, Richard, I'm going to ask you first the question, and I'll ask Steve if he wants to add anything else. How was the response of the book when it came out?
Well, before we get to that, we should mention that it got COVID delayed for a considerable period of time, which was kind of nerve-wrenching.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that's the same thing that happened to Steve, is you just wonder, you're just hanging, wondering if or when it will ever come out. So,
Yes.
because it was supposed to appear in October of last year.
Mhm.
That's right.
And it was delayed first by not being shipped over from China on time,
Mm-hmm.
and then delayed because it's set for 2 months in New York Harbor on a ship.
Oh, God. Mm-hmm.
And so it was supposed to, they backed the time up to November 1st, and then they backed it up to don't know when.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually did come out, I think, the week after Christmas.
Mhm.
It started hitting bookstores and stuff, but it was that's a 3-month wait after you get people who are saying, oh, I want to buy this. That's a long
Yes.
time. So I was very happy that it finally did come out.
Mhm.
It turned a profit within the first month. I mean, that means all the company's money that they put into it for shipping, for printing, for design, for the covers, for the colors, all that stuff, all paid for in the first month. I would say probably the first 5 weeks.
Yeah.
And that's the best news I've ever had on a book. So,
Yeah. Like I said, if John Morrow was happy, which made us happy.
Yes.
And I know he kind of sat on pins and needles waiting for the book to be, along with his other publications that he had printed in China, because this wasn't his only book. And so he was waiting on it and whatever else at the time to clear customs.
Mm-hmm. But yeah.
one of the other books that got stuck in limbo was the John Severin book,
Yes.
which is a
Mhm.
good tie-in with our book because we talk a lot about John Severin.
Mhm.
Yes.
Not as much as we would like to have, but he was a major war artist. So,
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
but and numerous magazines that I had articles and interviews in were held back for months at a time too. So,
Oh. Mm-hmm.
and still are at actually
Mm-hmm.
the time length of when they actually are announced to come out and when they actually do come out is about a month and a half difference,
Yes. Mm-hmm.
even now.
Yeah. But Richard, I mean, that's amazing that, that, like you said, in 5 weeks, that's incredible. That's
That
great.
seems very fast to me. I be frank, my first book, I'm not certain has ever turned a profit. So even though I think it's a very good book,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it turned. And I have no idea if it turned a profit, because you don't get that usually from a publisher. When a publisher tells you we turned a profit, that's a nice thing to hear.
Mhm.
So,
And then have you heard from any but now this is an off the cuff question. Have you heard of any fan feedback of the book? Like if you guys are at a convention or something? Mhm.
most of what I've gotten is from the Amazon reviews, which
Yes.
have been 100%
Mhm.
favorable, and that's also unusual.
Yes.
Mhm.
If you read written announcements from comic book fans or reviewers, they're often quite vicious.
Yes.
Not all the time, but
Oh, yeah.
comic fans have a tendency to, oh, you didn't include what I wanted to read about, so I hate you forever types.
Mhm.
And these have all been very complimentary. They have pointed out some stuff that they wish. The biggest thing is they wish the book had been longer. That's a nice thing to hear.
Yes.
That's good. Yes. Yeah.
But I don't think that most people realize that the writers don't set how long the book is. The publisher does. So
Yeah. Mhm.
we were told 160 pages.
Oh, okay.
So we came in exactly where we were supposed to.
Yeah. We had to work on it
Yes.
to get it that way. But to be fair, we had a lot of images that we include, that really filled out the book.
Yes.
But then again, with comics being entirely a visual medium, that's what we needed, and we packed the book with lots and lots of pictures to look at.
Yes.
And I think this would be a good spot to mention our designer for the book, because I really think he did an outstanding
yes.
job.
Yes.
It was a fella named Scott,
Yes.
and I can't remember his last name.
Savage. It's
There
hard.
you go.
Anyway,
Okay.
Is it
But he
some-
did a fantastic job of making it look good.
Yes. Mhm.
Also,
And he-
like to point out that John Cook, the editor of Comic Book Creator and
yes.
comic book artist at one time, was the guy who found that Joe Kubert art for the cover.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes.
It was actually an unpublished piece.
Yes.
Okay. That's
1964 drawing when DC was apparently trying to do a G.I. Joe comic.
oh. Mhm.
And it didn't go through, and that was the cut. That's actually G.I. Joe on the cover, not Sergeant Rock.
Oh, okay.
But it had the American flag on it. It had, it's a Joe Kubert cover, so who's going to complain?
Oh,
Well,
yes.
With Scott's wizardry, it really turned out good. This is actually the second version of the cover.
Mm-hmm.
The first one was probably Richard. I think we thought it was just a little busy, so to speak. So he kind of redesigned some of it and added some elements and moved a few things around. And what you see is we're quite pleased with it. I mean, it's really, really good.
I
looking.
believe he colored this cover, or someone did, who did a fantastic job, because it was only in black and white, of course, originally.
I if you guys don't mind, because I was looking inside the book, because I know John Morrow had a hand on the book. And Micro Cronenberg, I saw him as for the cover design. And then
Oh, he may have
Scott
done the cover design. Scott did the interior page.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the production, yes. And then also too, you guys had a proofreader too for the book too, Kevin Sharp.
Yes.
I hope he didn't have too many things to do, but we did have one sentence in there that had 3 complete errors in it. So
It made it through, unfortunately, but
yeah. That was the only
hopefully-
one. Everybody mentioned it the first time it came
Yeah.
out. Everybody said, "Oh, that sentence." And I said, "Well, one of those things was, spell check." It kept correcting the guy's name from what we typed into something else, and we didn't catch it on the 3rd or 4th time we went through.
Wow.
spell check can be quite maddening.
Apparently, spell check does not recognize Juniper as a first name.
No,
It turned it to Jupiter. So.
All right. So Richard and Steve, there is a sentence from the foreword by Willie Franz, and to me, it just sets the tone of the book, and I love it. Now, this book demonstrates writers and artists telling stories of conscience and consequences rather than mere action and adventure. Do you guys want to make do you guys want to comment on that?
Well, first, that is the quote that comes up most often when people say something about the book. Is that's the one, that's the paragraph they pull out, and I think they're entirely correct. I think that was our intent.
Yes.
Is that we wanted to do the best of the best, not. I love Sergeant Rock.
Yes. Oh, yes.
I'm pretty fond of Sergeant Fury, but they did things that were physically impossible, and they did them for years. I've made the joke many times that Sergeant Rock and Sergeant Fury are the two greatest air aces of all time, because they shot down planes constantly for 30 years with Tommy guns.
Yes.
And, that's a physically impossible thing to do. DC Comics, much as I love them, constantly had anti-aircraft guns hidden in haystacks. That's a good way to burn yourself alive. They constantly, both them and Fury, had people throwing grenades down the turrets of tanks. That can't happen.
Yeah.
First off, can't get that high up in the air unless you are like 7 feet tall. And second, because grenades won't go down a tank turrets, tank barrel. So, and those comics are riff with that kind of stuff.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong. I mean,
yeah,
compared to some stuff, I mean, any superhero comic has stuff like that happening all the time, stuff that's physically. But we wanted stories that were about real things.
Yes.
And these guys wrote and drew real things.
Yes.
So, and I'm sure Steve has some comments on that one too. So,
Well, probably a lot of the examples we picked are more grounded, would be a good way to put it.
Yes.
But sometimes to tell a story, you have to kind of suspend a little belief every now and then to make a point. And I mean, Kirby did that probably more than others, but Kanigher did too. I mean, but the point is not to examine it too closely. Sometimes just enjoy the story and it'll make a point, or you'll enjoy the art or something. It's characters that you are kind of becoming attached to would be a good way.
Yeah.
So, and not just telling a one-off story and that was it. You don't care anymore about who was in it or what happened. But the people we picked in this book, they would tell stories and you would get engrossed to it. I mean, even with the EC stories, they were grounded with basically real people. So, but visually, I think the art attracted me first when I was younger, and then the stories kind of, you start getting you just start reading better.
Yes.
Would be a good way to put it.
I think as a librarian, I think it's important to tell the truth to kids. And Kurtzman, in one of his comments in the book, says he didn't want to lie to children.
Yes.
He knew these books were mostly going out to kids. I mean, a lot of adults read them, but no matter how many times people say, "Oh, they were aimed at a higher audience," and they were.
Yes.
A lot of kids read them, and you really don't want to lie to them.
Yes. I'm gonna jump to this question, because the first chapter, focused on Harvey Kurtzman and the EC War comics. Now, the Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat. And there's, I remember reading, he in one of the interviews that you guys put in that chapter, basically like you said, he wanted to, he felt there was a responsibility to tell kids the truth about war, and he didn't want to glamorize it too.
Right.
So my question, and Steve, I'm going to ask you first, and Richard, you can comment. How important was Kurtzman to the war comics genre?
To me, he's kind of set the bar really high as far as accuracy.
Yes.
You know, he sent his artists to the New York Public Library to do the research. So when they drew a tank or an airplane or a submarine, it was as accurate as possible at the time. And that was authenticity was something that was very important to Kurtzman, you know, and plus he's sort of anti-war, but also he served in the war too.
Yes.
So in World War II, that is, not Korea. But he wanted to reflect real people in real situations. Richard?
I think that those two comics, Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat, pretty much set the template for everything that came after.
Yes.
Before that, it was all entertainment.
Yes.
I mean, they were great stuff. Boy Commandos, great stories.
Yeah.
Yes.
Black Hawk, great stuff and beautifully drawn. But they were entertainment. These were entertainment plus. And that aspect of, and part of that was because they were all war veterans now. In World War II, they were not veterans. Kirby and Joe Simon were doing those Boy Commando stories before either one of them got in the military.
Oh, okay.
And same with all the people doing the Black Hawk stories. They weren't really in combat. They had never been in combat. Will Eisner, not in combat at that time. Who wrote the first Black Hawk story. So when it came about the Korean conflict, these guys had been there. They had done that. They had seen people come home who had seen people wounded, people injured, people killed, come home to grieving families or come home glad to be home.
Yes.
So I think that made a huge difference. It also got a lot of people angry at them for writing those kind of stories.
Oh,
because the Kurtzman stuff got a lot of criticism from veterans who did not like that coming out in comics, that kind of story.
Oh.
And that's one of the things that they were complaining about. Not as much in war comics, perhaps, as they did about other genres, but war comics got their fair share of criticism for it too. And that certainly reflected farther down the line when something like Blazing Combat came up, because that was directly pushed on by both the military and conservatives in the industry.
That's right. If I remember correctly in the chapter, I think you guys didn't touch upon that. You know, that the military didn't, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, right?
No, they did. They did not like Blazing Combat because it says any kid reading that or any young soldier reading that won't enlist.
Yeah.
Or won't want to go to Vietnam, which was what was going on at that particular point in time. So, and they were probably a little corrected.
Well, and they didn't want to sell them on the bases anymore either because of the, sort of anti-war attitude that those 4 issues had, Blazing Combat.
Even though I don't think they were truly anti-war, I just think they were anti-waste. I mean, war is a wasteful thing anyway, but they were
go ahead.
tough and they didn't pull punches.
Yes, and I think
And one thing Kurtzman and Archie Goodwin and writers like that, they made the readers stop and think about these things.
Yes.
Not just look at it as entertainment, but they actually had a message or a moral, or after you finished it, you thought about, what happened in that story.
Yes.
Again, consequences.
Yes.
Because not just glory, they weren't glorifying war at all.
And I know you haven't had a chance to read the Sam Gladsman USS Stevens stuff, but Sam served in the military, served in the Navy, fought off kamikaze attacks. He was no punk, no draft dodger, nothing like that. In fact, I don't think any of them. We made the point of saying most of the guys that we're talking about in this book were veterans, and the ones who weren't were not veterans for a reason. Willie Franz, for example, could not get in the military because he had medical problems.
Yes.
So Garth Ennis, of course, isn't an American. He's an Irishman. So, but both Don Lomax, Wayne Van Zandt, I'm pretty sure Kanigher was in the military. Kubert certainly was.
Yeah.
Kirby was. He was actually,
Oh,
I
yes.
believe, injured in combat. I don't think he was shot. I think he had his feet frozen during the period of the Battle of the Bulge. But
Yeah. I mean, once you start reading about a lot of the creators in comics, you'd be surprised how many actually served. Maybe they didn't go overseas, all of them. Some
Yes.
stayed here, but
Yes.
for the most part, they're all part of the military process. You know, the chains of, that kept things, going.
Yes. Let's see. I was gonna
Like
ask.
Glansman, he served on board that destroyer named the USS Stevens. So that's a real ship.
Yes.
It's not a made up name. You can Google USS Stevens and, actually,
in fact, I was pleasantly surprised to look up how to do the schematics of a World War II destroyer, and they use the USS Stevens as the thing. It's actually called the USS Stevens schematic schemes.
yeah.
You can actually order the book, and it'll tell you all about everything about the USS Stevens you may ever want to know. And I'm sure that's because Sam Gladsman wrote USS Stevens years earlier.
Yes.
That's probably where they got their information from.
Yeah, that's what I would be thinking too. And also some of the initial drawings, because it looks awful lot like Sam showed me that ship. So.
Yeah, it's a Fletcher class ship. I remember because I built a model of the Fletcher.
Wow.
Anyway.
One thing I want to point out, and sorry, this is off the cuff observation, because now correct me if I'm wrong, because the Frontline Combat, these EC that was published by EC were, now correct me if I'm wrong, these were pre-comic book code, right? Is that correct?
Pre-code, yes.
Yes, you're talking about the comics code. Yes,
The comics code, yes.
both of those were pre-comics code.
Now, yeah, those, and unfortunately, the volume you have there, I think there's 3 volumes of the Frontline Combat that now is, I think Dark Horse is doing, and I think there's 4 volumes of the Two-Fisted Tales.
Oh, okay.
We highly recommend go buy every one of them.
Yeah.
Yes.
Best thing I ever spent money on, as far as I was ever concerned.
Yes.
Yeah.
So listeners, I know, it's just because.
Plus, look at that cover you've got in your hands.
Yes.
Yeah.
Look at that coloring. That's Marie Severin, John Severin's sister, doing that.
Oh, okay.
Look at the flare of light. That's fantastic. That's something you don't see in comics most of the time these days. That ability to make light flare up in front of your eyes.
Yeah.
And that's Harvey Kurtzman drawing right there too. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Because the other thing, I think, actually, let me ask you this question, because now this is all pre-comics code. The military was against it, and because in Frontline Combat, I read some stories. You see bullets being riddled. So soldiers are getting shot at. I mean, you see, grenades are going off, bombs are being dropped, and craters are created, on the ground and so forth. And then I'm going to ask you guys, I'm kind of jumping ahead because you guys touched upon this too in the book. How did the comics code change war comics?
You couldn't show someone actually being shot right in front of you.
Yes.
Russ Heath got around that by having the bullets not shown. He would be shooting at somebody with a Tommy gun, Sergeant Rock, for example. And behind the guy who was getting actually shot, you could see bullets hitting the wall behind him. So they didn't actually show the blood and the gore and the thing hitting him, but they showed the bullets had gone through him to hit that wall behind him.
Yes.
Battlefields got very clean.
Mhm.
Yeah.
There weren't any bodies laying around on the battlefield. There weren't any blown up tanks. I mean, there were blown up tanks. You saw them in earlier things, but when they did a panoramic view, it looked like they were walking through a nice little meadow.
Yeah, you might see a hand, or you might see a helmet
helmet.
laying somewhere, or
Yes.
smoke. There were ways of covering up, the violence that was happening.
Yes.
Or the violence might be described in a caption,
Mm-hmm.
but when you're looking at the actual art, you're not seeing any of that. You're seeing the aftermath, maybe somebody's jerking, but that's it. You don't see a bullet actually hit them.
Right.
Because
And that was mild compared to a lot of what the Comics Code did.
Yeah.
Yes. So because we're going to come back to the Comics Code when we start talking about Don Lomax's Vietnam Journal,
Mm-hmm.
and also some of the war comics that start to come out in the late, maybe around either in the 90s or in the early 2000s, when the Comics Code was almost, I think it was either
Code is gone.
It was fading out of usage.
Yeah.
yes.
They were allowing more things to be seen or written, or words. Some of the words were more allowed.
Yes.
But
A lot more blood.
Yes. And you got, yes. And like I said, I'm going to hold off to that because in my notes, you guys seen it, because I want to hold off on that part. So now, one of your other chapters in the early 60s, you guys mentioned, or in the early 60s, Charlton Comics and DC Comics were pretty much the only publishers printing more than one war title per month.
Well, that's not quite correct.
Okay.
Dell published several, and when Dell and Whitman split and Whitman became Gold Key published several titles as well.
Mm-hmm.
But Gold Keys weren't serious stuff. They were like adaptations of Hogan's Heroes and Rat Patrol and TV shows.
Oh, yes. Oh, okay.
Whereas Dell did Combat, which was one of the best books out there, and World War stories, and
And they all had
Jungle War stories, that sort of thing.
Air War stories and
Yeah.
World War stories, and they're all done by Glansman.
Oh,
Most of them, but Jungle War Tales wasn't
That's
done
true.
but the other three were.
Yeah. Jungle War stories, I think, and then it changed to Guerrilla War.
Oh yeah, it did. Okay, yeah, in his last few.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But it was also, Jungle War Stories was also the first one to do regular Vietnam stories
Yes.
before anybody else was doing that, except for EC did one Vietnam story when it was still French Indochina.
So I'm just going to ask, when you talked about the Jungle War stories, when they did Vietnam War stories at that time, how accurate? Now, this is an off-the-cuff question because it's the first time I've ever heard about this series. How accurate was the stories being told about the Vietnam War?
Probably.
Well, this was actually, some of those stories came out pre-U.S. major involvement, so it was advisors and that sort of thing going.
Okay.
So I don't know how accurate you might say. I mean, they were better written. They were not glory hounding stuff. They were not flag waving propaganda type stories. They were actually decent war stories.
Okay. All right.
I don't know if they were what I would call class A stories, but they were good, solid B stories.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's a good way to kind of grade them.
Okay. So, going back to my question, sorry. So, now, let's see. Now, chapter 2 focuses on Robert Tanger and Joe Kuber's creation, The Enemy Ace. Now, Richard, I'm going to start off with you first, and then Steve, please comment. May I ask, why was the Enemy Ace the focus of this chapter? And before we continue, I should ask if you can just give a little bit of origin story of who the Enemy Ace is to, younger readers and new listeners.
Enemy Ace was DC's anagram of the Red Baron.
Mhm.
He had the same kind of plane, same color of plane, same three-wing plane, but he was not the Red Baron. He was the Hammer of Hell.
Mhm.
Enemy Ace was a name that they just put up there. Nobody ever called him that in the stories, ever.
Mhm.
It's just the title of his series.
Mhm.
But he was called the Hammer of Hell. He was called, Hans von Hammer.
Yes. Mhm.
So, but he was a World War I German, and they had a problem with that when they came up with the idea. Well, I thought it was a great idea,
Mhm.
but they
Yes.
had a problem when they started that off because first off, he's a German fighting against Americans, and he's going to be possibly shooting down Americans all the time.
Mhm.
How do you make him sympathetic? So they made him kind of a Poe-like character. Edgar Allan Poe. He went around internally twisted by the decisions he was having to make about killing people.
Yes.
And the recognition that he was getting for it, like the Red Baron, he got little silver cups
Mhm.
to commemorate each plane he shot down, which the Germans actually kept up until silver became too scarce in the late part of the war.
Mhm.
Used to give him little silver cups and he could put them up on a big shelf and display them to everybody that he was shot that many planes down. But he was, first off, we were both, I think, personally, I wanted to make sure Joe Kubert got into that thing, into the book, because he certainly has done enough worthwhile work. And Kanigher is a good writer who was, like I mentioned in the book, he was a gimmick writer for a lot of his career. And that, I'm not saying anything against that. A lot of people were gimmick writers who were really good.
Yeah.
A lot of radio shows are well remembered today, but they were all gimmick shows if they were mysteries. That's the whole point. It's a gimmick show.
Mm-hmm.
You got the MacGuffin.
Uh-huh.
Here, the MacGuffin he was a German, and DC was a little afraid of it, of having a German soldier. So, enemy ace, Hans von Hammer, never fought an American in the original run.
Mm-hmm.
He fought French, he fought British, but he never fought an American until the mid-70s.
Mm-hmm.
But when he started out in the 60s, no.
Mm-hmm.
And they were still worried about it, that when they did ads for the new character that they were going to debut in the back of Sergeant Rock, I think it was, they didn't show his picture or his plane. All they showed was a bunch of question marks. Who is the major character who's going to be who is it?
Yeah.
Because they didn't want to, in the same way the Black Panther had his mask changed to hide the fact that he was black on the cover of Fantastic Four, because they didn't want to offend Southerners. They didn't want to offend Americans by saying, we're going to put out a comic book where the hero is a German guy fighting against us.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're not supposed to be, the readers, American readers aren't supposed to be sympathetic toward what is termed the enemy.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, they were trying to show an enemy combatant who actually kind of had morals and a conscience.
Yes.
Which was kind of what I think they were trying to get at,
Mm-hmm.
for the reader. And things were getting, about this time, a little more sophisticated in comics. I mean, so there were, Sergeant Rock had a black soldier.
Yes.
And they talked
So
about,
did Sergeant Fury.
yeah, they bleed red blood. So, I mean, these were, changing times in the U.S. and civil rights movement and stuff like that. So some of these comics were reflecting possibility that there are other viewpoints that can be presented.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And one of the things I don't think most people outside comics realize is that the war comics were really the ones that brought a lot of the social stuff up long before anybody else did.
Oh, okay.
EC did a story on the 442nd Nisei division. Didn't have to do that.
Yeah.
But they did it anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
The first black soldier who was in an integrated unit, even though integrated units did not exist in World War II, was Sergeant Rock with Jackie Johnson, like Steve was saying. The second one was Gabriel Jones and Sergeant Fury, again, integrated into a white unit, even though that was not possible in World War.
or having a
And it
Jewish
was so
character.
unusual that he was actually colored white in the first issue by the printer because they thought that the directions to color in black were incorrect.
Mhm.
And he did not appear as a brown African American for like 45 issues. He was gray.
Yeah.
Mhm.
He was brown on the covers, but gray inside the book all the time.
Yeah.
To placate, I suppose, Southern states.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But
And a lot of characters really didn't profess a religion
Yes.
like during those years of war comics. All the names are about the only things that gave them away,
Mhm.
possibly. But you had to say, oh, well, I think this character is Jewish, or
Mhm.
or something, or of German descent, or or Scandinavian, or something, just from the way their last name is. Like
Yes.
in Black Hawk,
Mhm.
since that was a multi, European combat group at first, or multinational. So
Yes.
anyway, yeah. So like I said, in the 60s, it was, the writers like Kanigher and some of the
Mhm.
others were starting to kind of explore, ethnicity and
Yes.
other themes like, the Holocaust and stuff like
Yes.
that.
Yes.
and the USS Stevens series introduced homosexuality to
Mm-hmm.
not just to war comics, to comic books completely.
Mhm.
They have a
Doesn't come out
story
and
in
say
here
it,
called
but
Toro that was
yes.
about, and they never mentioned homosexuality once. You just had to draw the inferences.
Mhm.
Yes.
He was clearly gay.
Mhm.
And they did another story that was on racism in the military, where blacks didn't get combat pay because they only worked as stewards on the boat,
Mhm.
on the ship. So
Ah,
they weren't getting combat pay, even though on occasion they may have to step up and fight in combat.
yes. Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
and that
And
was
one
just
thing,
the deal of that period.
yeah, it's a shame that earlier on in comics they didn't explore like the Tuskegee Airmen and some
Yes.
groups like that. They would have, to me, would have made good continuing characters.
Mhm.
But
But
there
they-
is an excellent Tuskegee Airman graphic novel by Garth Ennis that is well worth reading.
oh yes, uh-huh.
It's a
Ah.
really good book on that.
Mhm.
So
And
it
then
may take a while for everybody to catch up, but eventually it gets done.
yes.
Mhm.
Mhm. Yeah. Now, Richard, you mentioned about the 442nd, and because before we started the interview, um, because like to my surprise, because I have again, because you and Steve can see it because I have the frontline combat, the EC archives. I'm flipping through here and I see a short story about the 442nd, and
Mhm.
I was pretty amazed that it's probably like maybe one of the first and maybe one of the earliest stories that focused on the 442nd. And
In comics, I think you're right. I think it probably is exactly the first one.
yes.
And
And then I'm sorry, what were you
Kurtzman
gonna
had
say?
oh, go ahead.
No, what were you gonna say, Steve? Sorry.
Kurtzman had the clout, since he was primary writer and editor of the, those two combat, or war books for EC, that he could do stories like that.
Yes.
They pretty well. EC was very progressive in, the themes that they would present, not only in the war comics but in their other comics too. They explored, racism and oh gosh, bigotry and things like
Injustice.
that, injustice and fairness and truth and stuff like that. So Kurtzman was a truth teller, like Richard has said.
Yes.
And you got to give Bill Gaines, the publisher, a big pat on the back for that sort of thing too, because it wasn't just in the war comics. He had shock suspense stories, did stories about the Klan. They didn't call them the Klan. They were dressed in red, but they were dressed in Klan uniforms.
Mhm.
Mhm.
He did stories about cops actually committing crimes.
Oh,
Yeah.
firebugs that turned out to be firemen. People thought, oh, that couldn't happen. There was a huge case in California a few years ago of a fireman doing exactly that.
Yes.
Set hundreds of fires.
Yeah.
Or there's even one EC story about a man who's blind, but he's at a parade and he can't see the flags, and the crowd around him are super patriots and start inferring, all the wrong things about this guy. They wind up, I think, beating him and killing him.
Yeah, they beat him to death.
Yes. So, I mean, there's EC like to, present, injustice.
And again, there's that famous story that they did called
Master Race.
Yes, Master Race, which examines concentration camps. And it came out 1 month before the code came in and took over. And nothing in that story could have been published in the way it was presented that month. If it had come out a month later, it'd been completely disqualified by the comics code.
Yeah, it was in the first issue of Impact.
Yeah.
Which you should get that one.
I would get Impact just for that one story.
Yep.
But because it is a fantastic story. It's got everything. I mean, just brilliant writing, brilliant art. Even today, you could teach a master class on the artwork in that book.
Yeah.
And that one story.
If you read a little history about Bernard Craigstein, who did the art, he took the story and took the art and took things apart and reassembled them the way he wanted. So, and visually it's different from, I think Feldstein probably wrote it.
Yeah, Al Feldstein. Who was the lead writer for and editor of Mad Magazine for decades. So.
Oh yes. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So but listeners, again, that story about the 442nd, code in EC Comics, when I read it, it was, the dialogue was very natural. It was very real. It didn't, it was well written. It was just very well written. And then also too, Richard, you're also telling me that there was another story about the 442nd and had to deal with also had to deal with Sergeant Rock, written by Billy.
Sergeant Rock graphic novel that the 442nd made a major cameo, not cameo, they're in most of the book. And I can't remember the title, but it's by a fella named Billy Tucci.
I think it's called The Lost Battalion, maybe?
Yeah, that's it. Sergeant Rock, The Lost Battalion.
Yes.
And it's, first off, Billy Tucci is one of the best artists you will ever see.
Yes.
It's like looking at cathedral stained glass windows all the time.
Yes.
And he cares about accuracy also.
Yes.
Oh, that's good.
And I bought one of my granddaughters his Christmas book.
Yes.
Because he did a Christmas comic about Jesus, which was fabulously drawn and really, and this time it was really well written.
I'm trying to remember the title. I know which one you're talking about. Yes, I can't remember. Yes, but yeah. Yes, and probably watch after, as soon as we finish the interview, then the title will come to me.
Oh, that'll be all right.
Of course. Or you can go Google them.
Yes.
On Amazon, I guess. Anyway.
All right. Let's see. My next question. So my next question is, how did you guys, and Steve, I'll start off with you. How did you guys decide, like, what to focus for each chapter? How did you guys decide what to focus on each chapter of the book?
I think early on there was we got each other's email addresses and we're just, corresponding and started talking about, ideas for a book, and just, it just kind of a back and forth, and it just kind of, I don't know, over time it started coming together that we should collaborate, because we both have an interest in the big five titles to start with, but it was more than that.
Yes. Mhm.
When we refer to the big five for your listeners, that's DC had 5 war comics out in the late 50s, and they were called the Big Five.
Mhm.
And we were thinking that, I don't know whose idea it was, that the Big Five shouldn't really refer to titles. They should refer to the best stories.
Mhm.
So it started out with the idea that it would be 5 writers, and it grew to be a bigger than the Big Five. So of course that title didn't match any longer. But
Yes.
Yeah.
and John Morrow actually gave us the title of our book, and it was a really good title. So I'm not complaining one little bit about that.
Now, Richard, I'm going to say the big five that you're talking about from DC, the titles, and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm hoping I got it correct, is that it was Our Army at War, Our Fighting Forces, All American Men of War, Star Spangled War Stories, and GI Combat. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
All right. And then now let's see. And then from there, like how did you guys do your research, or how did you collect your research? Did you have some of these comics in your collection, or did you?
That I'll say yes to that.
Yes. I have hundreds. I have like 4 boxes full of just war comics.
Yeah, I've got
And
lucky.
a couple of shelves devoted to graphic novels on
Okay.
war comics. So
Yeah, I have all the DC war comics, and just we're pack rats would be a good way, sort of a
No.
way to put it. We're
No,
you
we're
know,
collectors, Steve. We're collectors. We're not cat rats.
okay, we are aficionados. would be a
Yes.
good- You know, I mean, but it's more than just one to have it, read it once, put it on a shelf. It's, we really appreciate the writing and the, and the graphic storytelling and the art. And, it's more than just, okay, I got this, I'll save it for, 30 years.
Yes.
So,
Mhm.
and we both, really like all these books that we've, have enjoyed all the, from childhood on to now.
Yes. Mhm.
Still
and
do.
some of that stuff was easy to collect. Sergeant Rock, not that difficult to find books.
Yeah.
with Sergeant Rock.
Yes.
Or Sergeant Fury.
Yes.
That Charlton stuff, that was not as easy as you might think. It's much cheaper,
Yeah.
but it's not easy to find them all.
Yes.
They had so
So-
many different titles over the years and reprints and stuff like that. But
Well, and they used the same title for like 5 different comics
Yeah.
too. So that didn't help matters.
Oh God.
there's really some, if you don't mind and you're very patient, there's some good stuff in those Charlton War comics. I don't want to.
Yes.
I like Pat Boyette's stuff there. I like Tom
Mm.
Sutton's in particular. I like Tom Sutton's
Mhm.
really good at war comics, and you wouldn't think so because he's mostly did Star Trek or he did horror comics.
Yes.
Really good war artist,
Mhm.
and he painted covers. Charlton put painted covers on their stuff.
Oh yeah,
Marvel and DC did not do that. Dell did,
yeah.
Full Key did,
Yes.
but they were big time comic book people, and Charlton actually put painted covers in. There were some really good painted covers on those
Yeah,
things.
yeah. Boyette did a lot. Well, he did quite a few of them, but Tom Sutton did some too.
Mhm.
Tom did only a couple of war comics, but he did a
Mhm.
lot of painted horror covers, and they're
Yep.
really, really good. And they would entice you. I mean, you look at that stuff, you say, yeah, I want that comic.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm. So-
And Charlton, unlike others, wasn't afraid to get a little bit over the edge too.
Yeah.
To see a
And-
bondage cover on a comic in the 70s was way unusual. And Tom Sutton painted a bondage cover on one of the books.
But one thing, and this is probably a good time to mention this, Charlton didn't watch their editors didn't, oversee some of this,
Yes.
material that appeared, especially the Willie Schultz. And maybe toward the end, it got pointed out to some of them and they pulled the plug. But for a while, I mean, Willie Franz could, explored some themes and stories that might, we're lucky to get presented,
Mhm.
and Sam did, the art matched the story, perfectly.
And you're talking about Sam Glanzman. So-
Yes.
Steve, I'm going to say this is the perfect segue because because my next question, I'm going to ask you first, and Richard, please comment because you already mentioned Willie Franz. Talk about how Willie Franz and Sam Glasman teamed up to write one of Charlton Comics war comics. And I'll let you talk about the character that they came up with.
Basically, Franz, liked Glanzman artwork. Sam did a lot of stories for Charlton. And he wrote him a fan letter, and they kind of got and then he kind of, I think, wrote I might be wrong, Richard, you can correct me.
I think they were connected for actual working together by editor Dick Giordano.
Yes.
But they were already in contact with each other because Willie had been sending fan letters to Sam Glasman for a while.
Yeah.
And
Sam
it had
didn't
something to
realize
do
his
with,
age.
no, go ahead.
Oh, Sam didn't realize Willie's age at first either.
Right. He was 15 years old when he was started writing for them, and he was writing tough stories.
That was mature work.
Very mature work.
Yeah. But it's a good pairing of two creative people, and I think Sam was surprised at how good Willie wrote, and and the stories still hold up to this day. I mean, they're that strong.
Willie told me a story about he wrote a story called The Cupidaw, which Sam did not illustrate it. I think Sanyo King, a Korean artist, illustrated it. I'm not going to swear to that one either, but it was not Sam who drew it. But it's about two kids who are amoral, and they kill people over if they give them food, they're not happy to see them. They'll be willing to kill you if that's what they thought they needed to get away and survive in that World War II era. And he showed that to Joe Kubert as a story he thought that DC might like, and Kubert said, "This is really dark." And he only got one story published by EC or DC, excuse me. But Willie wrote dark stuff.
It was and again, Charlton's editorial, or overseers, it just kind of slipped by him. It made it through, which is a good thing, really. Otherwise, I don't think the stories would be as relevant or as strong if they had been heavily edited.
None of what Willie and Sam did at Charlton would have been okayed at either DC or Marvel. None of it.
At that time.
At that time. 20 years later, yes, but not in the 60s and early 70s.
And then let's see. Do you guys want to talk about how because one of the comics that Willie and Sam before I want to let readers know again is that there is a chapter focused on Charlton Comics and especially on Willie Franz and the character and one of Charlton's comics continuing war in one of their war comics, one of their continuing characters that he wrote for was called Willie Schultz. So you guys want to talk about that and the importance of Willie Schultz in the Charlton comics?
Willie Franz would have been about 16 when he started that one off. And the plot line concerns an American soldier who's falsely accused of murdering a general's son. And he's been condemned to the firing squad for that. And during a attack by the Germans on his Jeep that's carrying him to his death, he gets away, and for the rest of the serial, he switches back and forth between serving with the Germans or serving with the Americans, which is a pretty radical idea because he's actually in battles in dealing with that kind of stuff when he's opposing his own side, trying not to do anything, but you got to stay alive. You got to stay alive. So, and it didn't get concluded in the 70s because of reasons that are said in the book. I don't know if we need to go into them. But it is going to be concluded we mentioned we had the cover of a upcoming collection and a page from that story illustrated by Wayne Van Zandt, because Sam Glasman was in his 90s and was too old to finish the story off. And it is going to be published at this point in January 10th of next year.
Wow.
As a hardcover, I believe, by Dark Horse, and it is on Amazon if you want to look at pre stuff. It's well worth your time. It's been years and years in the making. I mean, many years in the making at this point, because this was first brought up in the early 90s as completing the story. And it just didn't happen then. So it's 30 years later almost now, and it's got a chance to come out after many, many stoppages.
Yes, it's been a long time, a long journey to conclude it.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I've read the ending, and I think Steve has too, and I guarantee you it is as good as all the rest of the book.
Okay.
Yeah. And we'd like to, since we kind of did a chapter, and Wayne Van Zandt is one of our 3 favorite current creators.
Yes.
He does a very marvelous job, with that concluding chapter. Yeah, he's very if you had to choose someone to do it, he'd be the go-to person.
Yes.
And I think it was our suggestion to Sue that got Wayne okayed for that. So I'm not sure which of us said that first, but she apparently paid attention and took a look, because Wayne's art is not that far from Sam's, just like Sam's is not that far from Joe Kubert's. But
as a side light, Glanzman did some of the for Dell, the Green Beret comics, and he had to sort of imitate Kubert's, strip style that Kubert was doing for the comic strips of the Green Berets. So anyway, that's kind of a side light there.
Actually, Steve, I'm going to jump to the next question. And
okay.
Actually, I'm going to start off with you, Richard, because you already talked about Wayne Van Zandt. Now, in the mid 80s, there was a shift of war stories from World War II, because I read comics in the 80s, and I already saw Sergeant Rock comics. It was not, I can't say the right term, but I'll just say, but it was slowly dying out already, But also too, in the mid 80s, we also saw the emergence of stories about Vietnam, So I'm going to ask, and I'm talking about like Marvel's, the Nam series, and also I think and Don Lomax's Vietnam Journal. So I'm going to ask you guys, so I'm going to start off with you, Richard, and also correct me if I'm wrong, because I think Wayne Van Zandt also started to do some Vietnam stories in that time period too. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
He was doing black and white short pieces for a magazine called Savage Tales.
Oh,
Those were World War II, but he did do some other ones.
okay.
Yeah, he did some of the Nam stories too.
Yes.
Yeah.
And a few covers.
Yeah.
Well, he did a lot of the Nam stories. He was probably
Yes.
the main artist on the book for most of its time, although they occasionally had other artists step in and do, take him off. And the reason I think that, we mentioned earlier that Two-Fisted Tales and Frontline Combat were drawn by combat veterans from World War II, which was only 5 years had passed.
Yes.
A lot of the stories in those books centered on the Korean War, which is current. And after that, it was World War II up until we got into Vietnam, and there was a few efforts. DC attempted to do a series. It was dreadful.
Yes.
Vietnam. It really was dreadful. And Marvel did World War II stories that were addressing the Vietnam, and so did DC. Sergeant Rock, a lot of Sergeant Rock stories addressed that stuff. But after the failure and the protest against the war, they didn't do very many Vietnam stories. I think I can only remember one in the early 70s and one in the early 80s.
Mhm.
And those are two short pieces. That nobody else was doing Vietnam stories except for, again, Charlton did them with Shotgun Harker.
Mhm.
He was stationed in Vietnam, and that was a Joe Gill story
Mhm.
series, drawn mostly by Sam Gladsman, but not completely.
Mhm.
There was another artist who started it off who passed away, and then I think it was Jack Miller, maybe Jack Miller, that was the guy who came in after Sam.
There were several.
Jack Keller, he was the guy who did their Speed Dragster comics.
Mhm.
Yeah, and Baki, I think also.
Yeah,
Baki
yeah,
was-
Baki was the guy who started it off,
Yeah.
Mhm.
Anyway,
but he passed away. But by the 80s, the people who were starting, Doug Murray and Don Lomax, were Vietnam veterans. They
Mhm.
didn't have all that experience with World War II or the Korean War. And the Vietnam War had been untouched mostly for the last 2 decades,
Yes.
completely untouched. So it was an open place. You could write a good stories there, and it wouldn't be copying the same old stuff. You mentioned that they were the Sergeant Rock and Sergeant Fury getting a little tired. Well, that's because they'd been operating in a 5-year war for 20 plus years at that point.
Mhm.
So that wouldn't be unusual. And so the Nam, in particular, because it was Comic Code approved, was actually a pretty daring thing to start off with.
mhm.
Yes. Mhm.
And Don Lomax's stuff was independently published, so they didn't have to worry about the Comics Code whatsoever.
Yes.
And Van Zandt was going, he was doing the Nam for a long time, and when that stopped, he went into independent publishing too. So,
Mhm.
and he's done a lot for a lot of different publishers.
Mhm.
So,
He has a book about the history of Vietnam. So Vietnam.
yeah, and it's a really good book on the history of Vietnam.
Yeah, but Don Lomax, he's well worth getting all of his books.
Yes.
But also Van Zant's, if you can track down all of his stuff, they're all good.
Mhm.
So.
And then you got Garth Ennis, who
Yes.
people think of him only as a superhero or as that violent superhero stuff, but
Yes.
he writes really, really good
Yeah.
graphic novels.
And
Yes.
some of them are based on, probably would be historic, historic fiction would be a good way to put it. But some of his stories, like the String Bags, is based on real people, real incidents, real squadrons, things like that. So
Mhm.
There's one about Russian snipers called Lara that we put a picture of it and made a short
Mhm.
comment on, but we didn't really have time to space to expand on it.
Mhm.
But it's an excellent book.
Mhm.
And it's based on a true thing too. There were women snipers in the Soviet army during World War II.
there are women pilots too.
Yes, he did Night Witches.
Night
Which
Witches.
I'm surprised he wrote that Night Witches story, and then about 2-3 years later, a whole bunch of Night Witches books came
Mhm. Yeah.
by women writers, so that's
Mhm.
okay. But I was surprised at how many people were using the word Night Witches, because that was their nickname, not their designation.
I'd like to throw back to your 442nd reference. One thing that Kurtzman and a lot of comic readers were probably 8 to 14 years old that were reading these things even back in the early 50s, and then they graduate. They got older, and then a new group shows up.
Yes.
To start reading comics, and these are places where a lot of these kids, they didn't know much history.
Yes.
They got exposed to the 442nd or World War I pilots or Vietnam and things like that. This gave them a chance to go explore the real history about these people and places and things. So
It was kind of a history channel for kids.
yeah. It was, a lot of it was fiction, of course, but it was historic fiction.
Well, even
one
DC
thing-
and Marvel, when they did a D-Day special or something like that, they tried to be accurate to a lot of the stuff. Yes, they were including their characters in it, but
Yes.
that you would expect that.
Yeah.
but I'm going to say, but but Steve, that's a very good point because, and Richard, you also made a point too, because when I started to read Sergeant Rock comics, I mean, again, I'm 10, 15 years old.
Hmm.
Sitting in a classroom, somebody, a teacher talking to us about history and stuff, and I'm, and let's be honest, and I'm sorry, Richard, I know you're a librarian, but but most kids are kind of, if they're not into it, they're going to be bored.
Mhm.
But for me, it's like, reading Sergeant Rock comics. Oh, okay, this is, World War II, but you know, so we're exposed a little bit about the history, World War II, but then also too, Richard, like you said, um, also the social commentaries, we're already being put into place already too. Because
Mhm.
again, honestly, I didn't even realize that in World War II that there were, there are segregated units. I didn't know that there was just one for whites and one for blacks.
Yeah.
I just thought that everyone just served all together,
Well,
basically.
or Asians, for that matter, with 442nd.
That's yeah. And I just thought that,
We're not allowed to fight in the Pacific, by the way,
Yeah.
yes, that's right.
They sent them to Europe.
Yeah.
because they thought American soldiers would mistake them for the Japanese and shoot down their own
God,
men.
yes,
Yeah.
no, yeah.
Or they would have a problem
It's
fighting people that look like them.
yes.
Or
So,
might be relatives, for all we knew.
yeah.
Although that problem didn't bother them when they sent white boys over to fight white Germans.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, that's true too. Yeah.
There's
Yeah.
unfortunately in the when you start studying war and a lot of good people had good intentions, but they didn't carry it through. It didn't work out right.
Yes.
But anyway, that's it in a nutshell. But there's more to it than that.
Yeah.
But one thing that comics, they were trying to do was point out injustice.
Mhm.
And
And it's kind of hard to talk about World War II and the injustices and not address on occasion the injustices that were happening behind our lines.
yes,
So,
yeah, and anyway, yeah, I mean that's a whole another whole chapter right there. Could be on just bigotry and
You could probably do a whole book on that at this point.
yeah. But anyway,
before I continue on, because I want to go back to this because we have to talk about the king. Richard, I'm going to start off with this was I didn't know this. I didn't know that I knew Jack Kirby did the boy. If I remember correctly, he did the Boy Commandos, correct?
right.
Okay.
Yes.
But I did not know in the 70s that he wrote and drew the Losers. So
Mhm.
how did that come about? Do you guys know how that came about and so forth? And
Kirby's own comics, which were mostly science fiction or superhero, DC had kind of soured on him. But they had a contract with him saying he had to write a certain number of pages, write and draw a certain number of pages a month.
Mhm.
So they gave him the Losers because it was the one that I don't know exactly why they gave him the Losers. It was actually going through an extremely good storyline at that point in time
Mhm.
by Robert Kanigher and John Severin.
Mhm.
But Kirby took over the book for a year.
Oh, okay.
12 issues straight, which fulfilled his contract, and then he was out of DC for about 6 or 7 more years.
Mhm.
But that's basically how that came about. Is he had a prescribed number of pages, and they had to find something for him to draw.
Mhm.
And they were leery about starting a new book since he'd already had 2 new books on the stands at that time, and they didn't want to do 3.
Mhm.
So they gave him an established title, which in Kirby fashion, he promptly ignored everything that had gone before.
Okay. Yes.
Nothing wrong with that. A lot of writers do that.
Yeah.
Kirby, it just became noticeable because his storylines never followed anything close to what was coming on before him.
Yeah.
If you took over Jimmy Olsen, you would not have known it was the same book.
Mhm.
So, but it wasn't like he was. I mentioned in the book that you could have read every Loser story as a different story about 4 different soldiers each issue, and it would have worked. It would have read just as well as it did. He was not continuing the characterizations of them whatsoever.
Yeah.
But they were all good stories, solid stories.
Oh,
Mhm.
okay.
I can't think of any of them that were stunk.
Mhm.
And I really think A Small Place in Hell and The Partisans are two of the best 1970s war comics out there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Small Place in Hell is just action from one end to the other,
Mhm.
but carefully done action.
Mhm.
There's a scene in the book where Lieutenant Cloud, who was not the leader in pre-Kirby books, it was
Mhm.
Captain Storm was the leader.
Yes.
Lieutenant Cloud became Kirby's go-to leader for them.
Mhm.
His face gets scorched by a flamethrower.
Mhm.
And over the course of the pages, without saying anything about it, his eyes slowly get more and more swelled until he's just looking through two glints between his eyes. That's all he can see because his face is scorched.
Mhm.
And Kirby doesn't mention that anywhere, that his eyes are scorched or that he's been burned by that flamethrower. And he's going blind as he's fighting this battle. He just lets you infer that as you read along. And I thought that's really subtle, good storytelling.
Yes.
Just that his eyes get more and more swelled and more squinty as the story goes along. And he doesn't draw any, because there's no time to do any of that.
Yeah.
This is a breakneck story.
Mhm.
And I think it's a fantastic story. There's not a minute lapse in that battle from start to finish.
Yeah, I think it's a good example of, the artist is the writer, and the writer is the artist,
Mhm.
So, it's instead of two people working on one thing with two different viewpoints,
Mhm.
it's his viewpoint,
Yes.
and he has the vision for what he wanted to do with these characters,
Mhm.
for all these issues. And so, and people kind of dismiss Kirby as a writer, but honestly, he wrote a lot of stuff,
Yes.
during his career.
He wrote a lot. He co-wrote a lot of those Boy Commando stories.
Yeah,
Mhm.
so
And I think he wrote a lot of the ones right up through the mid-50s. He was the main writer
Mhm.
yeah, so
or co-writer on almost everything he was putting out there for a while. And I think he continued that, even though he didn't write the dialogue when he was working with Stan Lee.
Mhm. Yes.
That Lee wrote the dialogue, but Kirby wrote the dialogue on the sides of the panels around it so that Lee would know what was going on.
Mhm.
So
Let's see. I'm going to move on to. I'm going to kind of jumping around. So, Richard. So I'm going to ask you to talk about this character that Wayne Van Sant wrote. And actually, yeah, if you could just give background to this to the listeners. Wayne Van Sant wrote a fictitious World War II story called Kashuta. Is that
Ka-
correct?
Katusha.
Yes.
yeah,
Can, because I read it, because I read that section and I was going, it seemed a little appropriate what's going on right now in Ukraine.
well,
Mhm.
sure.
Do you guys want to talk? Yeah, Richard, I'm going to start off with you. Do you want to talk about this?
Okay, for your listeners, this is the longest graphic novel I've ever seen in comics, period.
Mhm.
It runs 654 pages. So be prepared for that, but you're getting a lot of story.
Yes.
She's a young girl who, on the day she graduates from what would be Russia's version of high school, the Nazis invade her country, which was the Ukraine, part of the Soviet Union at that point. And she starts off her career as a person in the occupied territory of Ukraine. She's there when Baba Yar, a massive massacre of Jews by the Germans, took place. She goes on the run as a refugee, and then she becomes a resistance fighter while she's hiding in the cave as a refugee. And she starts fighting the Germans as a resistance fighter. And gradually, after Stalingrad takes place, she joins the military with her older stepsister, and they become tank. And they were tank. She's a tank driver, and her sister's a tank commander. And they fight in the tank corps during big tank battles during World War II. And it just chronologues her story through the war years. And you can see her sister slowly becoming more and more bitter and cynical and nasty and wanting to thinking all that exists in life is killing, where she stays somehow hopeful.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's a beautiful characterization of someone who has every reason to do exactly what her sister's doing.
Yeah.
But she resisted. And there's a nice little coda at the end that brings you up to date on what she's doing today, but it's set in the Ukraine because Ukraine's the breadbasket.
Mm-hmm.
It's a major area to the Black Sea. Soviet Union really wanted it. And there are almost no, to my knowledge, except for Khrushchev, I don't think there's any actual human beings that someone would recognize. Khrushchev turns up in the story in a very, I wouldn't say comical, but unusual role.
Mm-hmm.
But
Mm-hmm.
but this is Van Zandt, I don't think is given enough credit as a writer, just like Sam Glatzman was not given credit as a writer.
Yeah.
And a lot of people weren't given credit as writers as good as they were. Jack Kirby, for example, got a lot of whining about his writing style. And I was thinking, he's not half bad.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
He has a problem doing modern day lingo for young kids, but hell, every writer back then did.
Yeah. I mean,
So,
they were old school, so to speak.
Well, you're talking about guys who were in their 40s and 50s. Are they really going to have all the slang down that someone in 1970s might say? My guess is probably not.
Yeah, Van Zandt, he did his research, and I think what people will learn through this book and Ennis's Night Witches and stuff like that is that the Soviets employed a lot of women in the military during those war years.
As combat troops, not as.
Yes. There was, there were snipers, there were tank commanders and drivers. They were
Night Witches is about bomber planes.
Yeah.
And not nice bomber planes, old World War I bomber planes that they had to glide in to drop their bombs in so people wouldn't shoot them down.
Yeah. I mean, scary stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, they came in silently. That's why they were called Night Witches. Because you couldn't hear them coming until the bombs started going off. But they were also flying very low in an old World War I bomber, and they had to start that engine and take off again to get out of the range of the old bomb they just dropped.
Mm-hmm.
And Van Zandt and Ennis both, when you read the stories and see the visuals, all these female, it's not glorified, and it wasn't pretty, and they showed conditions that were, very difficult, to carry out their duties in, but these writers and artists, they really, capture, the mood and the feelings of these characters, I think. But yeah, Katusha will both say, you need another book to buy, get that one.
Yeah, it may be long, but it's well worth it.
Oh, yes, it's worth the time and effort.
Well, but
it's not only the longest graphic novel, it may be, one of the top 10 I've ever read.
Well,
and I've read a lot of graphic novels.
But, Steve and Richard, like you guys said that, like with Ennis, Van Zandt,
Lomax,
and Lomax, I mean, they wanted to make these war comics grounded. This is, it's not all glory. It's not someone on the beach going, "Come on, man, we're gonna take this hill."
Right.
I cannot imagine but for Garth Ennis to do his research to show how, that, these are the conditions, that, the Soviet women as combat troops, what they had to, what the horrors of they had to go through, Lomax, showing this is what happened in Vietnam,
Yeah. It's real people with real dialogue.
Yes.
And to me, it's the stories are very compelling, would be a good way to put it. I mean, they really want you to immerse yourself in the stories and the characters. Yeah.
Enith just completed and Enith picks stuff that most people don't know about in America. His most recent book was about the Chindits, which most people have no clue in this country. I've heard of them, but I never really. And they were Indian troops who fought under the British command. And the blunders that they made because, they didn't consider them. Well, the racial thing crops up, but it's not really a racial thing. It's more of these aren't regular British troops, they're Indian troops. So if we throw them into the fodder just as ammunition, something that the German or the Japanese can shoot against, it's not going to kill more English boys. And I think it's called The Lion and the Eagle. Is that right, Steve? Or
I think so. Yeah, I have them. I just haven't read them yet.
Well, you should, boy. They're good.
It's
about a blunder, a British blunder.
Okay. Well, and if you really look back at history, even during World War II, British colonialism still creeps into a lot of that stuff.
All over the place.
Yeah, the attitudes.
The Aussies got butchered in World War I because they were considered more expendable than the British.
Yes, like Gallipoli.
Gallipoli.
Yeah.
Gallipoli would be an example of that.
That's right. The movie, yeah. That's right.
Yeah, well, yeah, Mel Gibson's in the movie, and Dell did a comic, World War stories, an issue about Gallipoli that Sam Klansman illustrated.
Yep.
There's your history right there.
Yep.
And I would like to point out something, that, in our research, there's things we may have just briefly mentioned in this book, but at this point, we're both kind of working on a second book that's very comprehensive. And Dell Comics was pretty bold in the Golden Age era, that they actually put out 2 war books. One was called War Comics and War Stories, and change it to War Comics or vice versa. But also they had another book about true stuff called War Heroes. So there were comic books back then that told real stories about real people. So, it's not all fiction, but there's some gems there when you go looking.
DC ran a Medal of Honor series in the back of many of their titles drawn by Norm Mauer, written and drawn by Norm Mauer, who was the son-in-law of Mo Howard.
Of the Three Stooges.
Of the Three Stooges. Yeah, yes. His wife was the daughter of Mo.
Yeah.
And they were really good. And Joe Kubert and a number of other people, Dark Horse started a Medal of Honor book in the 90s too, and it ran for 5 or 6 issues. It was actually quite good as well. Sometimes those things pop up.
Yes.
I have Frank Frazetta illustrations from a World War comic from back in probably 1947, 48, where he was drawing Medal of Honor 1-pagers.
Yeah. For Heroic Comics.
Yeah, that would be it.
Yeah, I'm still looking for some of those.
They had painted covers too. I interviewed one of the guys who worked on that, and he was the guy who painted the covers for it.
Was it Norman Saunders or the other Fuller?
I'm gonna have to look. No, it's not Norman Saunders. It was Norman Saunders. I'm aware.
Was it H.C. Kiefer?
No, it was. He did the last half dozen of them when they were military before they went back to, before they went back to adventure on the titles.
Yeah. Okay.
But he did a fantastic job. I've seen the covers and they're really beautifully done. So. But yeah, all those guys got. One of the nice things they started doing in comics for the last few years is when they're doing a story in Astro City or Batman or something, the streets and the buildings are all named after comic book creators, which I think is kind of cool.
Yeah.
In Astro City, I was just reading it and laughing because you mentioned Kiefer, and he's he's the Astro City slum square. The slum was named after Kiefer.
And believe it or not, the original Wonder Woman artist, H.C. Peters, did a lot of 1- and 2-page stories in those heroic comics
Yep.
published by Famous Funnies. So,
Mhm.
you know, like I said, there's
And of course, DC did Battle Album for a long time. There was 2-pagers done by Joe Kubert and Ken Barr and Steve Gladsman and whoever else they could. Walt Simonson, I think, did a couple of them.
Yeah.
And Jack Kirby included in all of his Losers issues and his early Sergeant Fury issues, he included stuff about arms and guns and military hardware and that sort of thing.
I remember seeing that in the Epic collection of Sergeant Fury. That's right.
Yeah. Well, he also did it in the Losers when he was doing those. He was
You not only were entertained, but you learned
something.
Yeah. Off the cuff question: when Jack Kirby, like Richard, you said that Kirby did 12 issues of the Losers. You know, do you guys know, has it been collected, or have you heard rumors if it's ever going to be collected?
It's collected. It's issued under the Losers by Jack Kirby. It's a full graphic novel.
Yeah.
Oh,
And it's got all 12 issues in it, and it's a goodbye. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, not goodbye like don't read. A good thing to purchase because I have it in my library and I have it in my bedroom. My shelves are all at. So.
All right. So Steve, I'm going to start off with you. This question is that, and Richard, please comment. You know, what do you guys think is the future of war comics today?
Oh, good.
And
well, other than DC doing the occasional kind of weird war stuff that they've been doing the past few years. In fact, there's a Sergeant Rock and I don't know, is it Zombies or something like that?
The Army of the Dead.
Yeah, it's just coming out or has just started.
I'll buy it just to buy it, but I don't, hold it up to the same criteria as we do the classic stuff.
Oh yeah.
But as far as DC, I think Richard will probably comment and say they just want to keep their copyright, the characters kind of in print. But to me, I think it's the graphic novels that is the direction that things seem to be taking. I mean, maybe at this point it'd be a good time to mention some of the publishers like Aftershock is very good. Dead Reckoning does some beautiful stuff.
And I should mention that Dead Reckoning not only publishes American stuff, they also do Garth Ennis, of course, but they reprint a lot of stuff from Europe that you don't see here. There's a 3-part Sea Battle book. I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head. That's done by French writer and artist. Excellent material.
Okay.
Yeah.
I haven't been disappointed by any Dead Reckoning book I've read to date. I haven't read all of them, but I have not been disappointed in any of them. And that's saying something, because it's easy to be disappointed in something that's not up to snuff.
European, I was just going to say, I can't think of the publishers, but there's a lot of European stuff that's being translated and printed now in English. And beautiful artwork. I mean, my goodness. And different types of stories too. So anyway, it's worth seeking out.
I think, now, Richard or Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, Dead Reckoning, because is that true? Isn't that through like the Naval Press?
Yes.
Okay.
Naval Institute.
Yes.
The U.S. Navy publishes these books, which is remarkable enough in itself that they're doing graphic novels. That they're doing such a good job on graphic novels tells you that the 2 women, as far as I'm aware, it's 2 women who are heading that department, know what the hell they're doing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's good stuff.
It is very good material. There's also some company in Indonesia that puts out books that take place in the India area that do some good stuff. And what you were saying before about the 2 big companies not really doing a whole lot, that's absolutely correct, unless it's some kind of hybrid.
Yes. Yes.
But there are excellent war books being done for younger children that don't necessarily focus on what people think of as a typical war comic, but they are. George Takei did They Called Us the Enemy.
Oh, that's excellent.
Which is about the Japanese internment camps in World War II. That's a war story.
Yes.
There's a book from France. Again, the name is escaping me right at this particular spot, but it's done by a French lady and a French writer, a lady writer, which is about a young Jewish girl trying to survive with the aid of a lot of Catholic, because most France is either Catholic or Jewish for the most part. She was first in a nun's school, and then they had to hide her, send her off over the line to Vichy, France for a number of years. And then the Germans took over Vichy, France. So she had to start moving her way down towards the coast to southern France, and the hope that, and it's all a story about her 5 years during the war, when she couldn't find her parents. She wasn't with her parents. She had been at boarding school when the invasion of France came about, and her ways of trying to survive it all, having to deal with different people pretending to be her parents, having to take clandestine journeys at night. I mean, that's a war story too.
Yeah.
And there are actually a lot of good French books coming out over in this country right there. Not all by Dead Reckoning, that are very, very good and beautifully drawn. So you should keep an eye out for that stuff, because nobody draws a good-looking French girl like a good-looking French guy.
Yeah.
Sorry, Steve. Full Magazine Publishing, right? Also does.
Full Mag. Yeah. By August Ewell or Ewell, however you pronounce it. Yeah, he has 3 issues out, I believe.
He's working on a 4th one. I don't know if it's I don't think it's come out yet, but I'll have to take a look, because it's been a while. I should take a look and see if it has.
Yeah.
But he's actually, last I heard, he was actually going to publish some of Sam's unpublished stories.
Oh, that's going to be nice.
Yeah.
He did publish the last artwork by Russ Heath.
Yes.
In his early issues. So, and there's a guy who, I don't know who, Gary Martin, I'm not really that aware of him, but he does nice war stories. So he's a modern day artist, but there are also other ones. Gary Kloss, I'm not sure how to say his last name, but he used to draw Conan the Barbarian for a number of years. And he does war stories now. He did a couple of books on the Civil War that were really good. And he did a couple of stories for him. So August's stuff is well written. He does a good job on it. The artists are decent artists, even if I've never heard of them before. And I've heard of a lot of them, because he actually went out and looked for war artists from the comics to do them.
It might not come out that often, but it's well worth getting,
Well, and it's also a fat magazine. People looking at maybe it's like a 90-page magazine. So you're getting a lot of story, a lot of content for whatever you're paying for it.
Yeah, I would like to mention some other people, other writers like Max Brooks. He's done a book about black soldiers that came from Harlem, Harlem Hellfighters. That's a real good one. There's another book called The Lincoln Brigade about other black soldiers in combat in World War I, and basically they went over and fought for us and came back and were maltreated, is a kind way of putting it, but
often murdered.
Yeah, they didn't get the the recognition they should have gotten for what they did. Anyway, those are just.
We were talking about segregated units in World War II. The reason that blacks weren't in combat units in World War II is because they were in World War I, and they came back with guns and knew how to use them. And that's the reason that they were not in combat positions in World War II. They were again in the Korean War, but they were segregated at the start of that too. It was Harry Truman who signed the deal saying that the units had to integrate. So it wasn't until 1951 or 52.
I might like to mention some of the Quality GI Combats.
Yes.
That was published by Quality before DC picked it up. And if you'll read some of those stories, they actually had stories with, integrated combat units. And there were some mentions of Indochina in some of those stories that, way before, the comic books picked them up, 10 years later.
Yes.
So, those are worth chasing down, those issues.
I'd also like to point out that for about a 2-year period during the Korean War, Marvel, which was at that time called Atlas, published some stories that were just as hard hitting as anything that DC was putting out.
Oh, okay.
And one of the writers of those, who was a really good writer, was a guy named Hank Chapman.
Yes.
And his were noted. You can often find a Hank Chapman story, even though, because it would say something, the title would be like Mud, Night, Dusk. And that's kind of a clue that Hank was probably involved in that, or it was somebody trying to copy Hank's style. But he was a very good writer, and he wrote comics right up through the 60s, but he's never gotten the recognition he probably deserves. And his were really good stories. And Stan Lee also wrote a couple of those Korean War ones, and they were not bad. Stan could be a good writer on his own when he needed to be.
There's one story that stands out to me. I think it was in Battlefield, something like that. It's called the Atrocity Story. That stands up to any Harvey Kurtzman written story.
And that's a Hank Chapman story. That's a Hank Chapman story.
It was
illustrated by Paul Reinman.
Yes.
And it's a great story.
And
there's also a story I think might have influenced Rod Serling on his, he did a concentration camp story for the Twilight Zone.
Death's Head Revisited.
Yeah, Death's Head Revisited, that's it. And it reminds you of a story that was written by an unknown writer. I'm not sure who the writer was, but it was illustrated by Sam Kuskin, who I did an interview with his kids. And I read the story and I'm thinking, this sounds like an early draft of Death's Head Revisited. It's the same basic notion.
Yes.
Is that a concentration camp commander goes back to the concentration camp where he killed all those people, and the ghosts come up and get him. And I thought, well, if you're going to steal, I don't know if Rod Serling was not a thief, but if you're going to be influenced by something good. And that was a good story too.
Really was.
Unfortunately, a lot of good stories got lost in the Kefauver trials, and when the code was, being touted and stuff like that, that actually before the comics code, there's a lot of trash and a lot of just entertainment and horror and stuff. But there's some very good stories that, they're there. You just have to go looking.
And luckily, those are the stories that are getting reprinted nowadays too.
Which is good.
Atlas at War is an excellent volume to pick up because it details a lot of those Atlas stories, Marvel stories nowadays, it'd be called. There's one called the Anti-War War Book that covers a lot of the Charlton stories.
Oh, okay.
We Spoke Out covers Holocaust stories, mostly by DC.
Yes.
Yeah.
And they were not chintzy people doing these. It was Neil Adams. It was Joe Kubert. It was John Severin. So it wasn't like they were sloughing them off on mediocre stuff. They were actually quite good.
Yes.
And Dover Books, a few years ago, have 2 collections of Sam Glanzman's USS Stevens, and then the entire book of all of the DC stories collected too. So, there's.
And I think that a book that's got a Democrat president and a Republican president writing a foreword, which I've never heard anybody else doing, has got to be something, because Barack Obama and George Bush Sr. both wrote letters in about the book and how much they enjoyed it.
We consider Sam one of those, all the others get all the press, but Sam really deserves a lot of, credit for what he did and contributed to the comic books.
Joe Kubert once told me that Sam's stories were there was a quality of charity in those stories. Yes, horrible things were happening in some of them, about the USS Stevens stories and about stuff that he'd written himself. He says, there's a quality of charity and a quality of decency in Sam's stories, even when you don't think it's going to happen.
Yeah.
And that's a difficult thing to do. And Sam did it in 4 pages, 5 pages, 10 pages, but he never did anything longer than 10 pages in the USS Stevens. They were 4, 5, and 10.
And a lot of his stories are from the viewpoint of the enlisted man, you know, not
They weren't all grim.
Nope.
The story about how you got shorely when you were out at sea and you couldn't drink beer on ship is actually quite funny. They'd find a reef, row your boat out to it, and drink the beer in the boat.
Actually, that's true stuff.
Yeah.
It really happened. And but yeah, there's, you know, and there's one story that he wrote called Comic Strip that's you know, kind of has a comic character in it, you know, but you know, it was a humorous look at, you know, at life in the Navy, you know, on board a ship.
All right,
Anyway.
Stephen, Richard, I'm sorry, I'm going to start wrapping this up with one last question, because I know, because I mean, we really could talk for hours, but
Yeah, we're at 2 hours. You're probably right. We probably should.
Yeah,
Close
have to
it
end
down.
it sometime.
yes. So I'm going to ask any closing words to our list. I'm going to start off with you, Steve, and then Richard. Any closing words to our listeners?
Richard, why don't you go first, alphabetically?
Okay.
I hope that it's significant to publishers that ours was the first American. There was a British one that concentrated on British comics, but ours was the first American book to concentrate as a nonfiction book on war comics. And it's a success. And maybe that'll tempt a few more books in that line across the line, including, you know, ones that we write too. So I'm not being stupid, but I think that indicates there's a market there that people are not getting addressed at the moment, not just for the nonfiction, but for actual stories. Garth Ennis has a new book coming out next week, British comics, out of a British comic publisher.
Oh, okay.
Wayne Van Zant has a book already completed. I've read it. Really good. About the, I believe it's the Battle of the Bulge, and a French Foreign Legion member fighting in the Battle of the Bulge, which I think is an interesting idea. Again, nothing I've ever seen before. Don Lomax stuff, you should take a look at it. I don't know if he's doing anything new at the moment, but I know he's in the middle of republishing a lot of his stuff, and that's a good thing because, you know, if it's out of print, hard to find.
Yes.
In print, easy to get right now.
Yeah.
So over to you, Steve.
Well, I was going to say, when we wrote this book, it was hard to figure out what to put into it and what to leave out of it.
Yes.
You know, and like I said, we've kind of are both, you know, we've probably taken a little break because of other things we've been doing, but, you know, we're trying to put together a second book that really is a comprehensive look at all war comics. I mean, this is just, you know, we're writing it. We, like I said, we had a lot of material that we didn't put in that first book. So a lot of it was already written. Now we're just organizing, but we're also finding new material to put into it and expand other things and condense a few things so we don't, you know, repeat too much. But for the most part, you know, that's what we're trying to do. Hopefully we're going to get it done, you know, in a reasonable amount of time. And another thing I'd like to point out that there are so many great graphic novels coming out that really you can spend a small fortune on. But the thing is, it's, you know, there's anywhere from, you know, Civil War to Africa to the art of war and stuff like, there's so many different viewpoints and books worth all getting, you know, that it's hard to pick and choose, but we've tried to mention a few things worth getting. So, but, you know, luckily there's still new stuff coming out, you know, it's, and we, you know, we feel like there's those three writers that we really, Van Zant, Lomax, and Ennis,
Yes.
are probably three of the best ones, but there are some others too worth
Mhm.
finding. So, and there's books from even about animals in war. So, so there's one called Four-Footed Tales, I believe, something like that.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think that's right.
I think I have it. I have a big stack of things I need to read, but anyway.
Well, and the nice thing is that if you've never read it before, it doesn't matter if it's new or old, it's all new.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah.
So,
And, and want to thank you again for wanting to listen to us and ask us questions. And thanks for the goodies you sent. I want to, good stuff. You don't need to do that again. Okay. You don't have to, but they were delicious.
Oh, you're
and much
welcome.
appreciated.
No,
Yeah,
you're
much
welcome.
Thank you.
appreciated. Yeah.
Thank you
We
again for this.
appreciate what you're doing.
No, thank you. So, Richard and Steve, just mahalo. Thank you in Hawaiian for your time. Thank you for giving me another opportunity to interview the both of you, about, your incredible book, Our Artists at War. I love I'm like I said, there are a couple of chapters I wasn't able to read, but what I've read so far, it's great. It really is. It really
thank
is.
you.
Thank you.
And
Yeah.
also too, because I love that one chapter you guys focus on Charlton Comics, and especially about Willie Schultz. And I'm glad to hear it's being collected and it's gonna come out hardcover through Dark Horse. Is that correct, Richard?
Yes,
I
that's
think you can,
what I
yeah,
understand.
go ahead. I think you can go to Amazon and possibly go ahead and order a copy.
Yes.
Okay.
I
So-
ordered mine or pre-ordered mine from Cheap Graphic Novels. Same
Mhm.
thing though. You get the
Yes.
nice discount, and it's
Oh yeah.
generally you get the book fast.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we hope it'll be out because it's one of those that's been promised for about 2 years now. So it's
Wow.
taken.
Well, and it's been in the works for 2 decades. So yeah,
Yeah,
I'm
so-
eager to get it.
So we should, it'll be well worth waiting for.
Mhm.
If not, just for that final chapter, that we've both seen. So that's why you got to get the book.
And if it does well, maybe we'll get the Iron Corporal and other
Oh
stories.
yes,
because,
that's right.
because the Iron Corporal is a pretty good graphic novel in and of itself too, by the same 2 creators. So
Yes.
Mhm.
Willie Franz and Sam Glansman.
yeah. And other stories would include all the other stuff that Willie wrote.
Yeah. So, there's such a wealth of, reading and of all those. I know war comics is a genre that's not as popular as all the superheroes and all the stuff. When you go to a comic shop, what you see, selling, but we think, the two of us and you, of course, believe that this is well worth reading about and exploring and
Yes.
the history of them, and there's such a wealth of stories that have been done that are worth seeking out and getting and reading. So anyway,
Oh yes, but thank you, Steve. Yes, and Richard, I want to thank you very much again for reaching out to me to let me know how well the book had done. Thank you very much. Now also for if you are a new comic book reader or a lifelong comic book reader or one of those comic book readers that just love war comics, all in. And I'm talking about any type of, from World War I to Civil War to even the Vietnam War. Please check out Richard and Steve's book, Our Artists at War: The Best of the Best American War Comics. Again, it's available through the Tomorrow's website again, and it's TWO M as in Mary ORROWS. It's through their website. Or you can order through your local comic shop, or even through Bud Plant Art website as well too.
mhm.
So,
Or just a bookstore.
yes,
Yeah, or even just a plain bookstore or Amazon. There's luckily there's several sources where you can find the book.
Yes. And then, and if, and listeners, if you have a friend who, who enjoys reading war comics, please consider giving them this book as either as a Christmas present, because Christmas is coming, like, about 3 months away, or as a birthday present. Just consider thinking about that. So I also want to, oh, sorry, Steve, what were you guys?
I was going to say, some of the books and comics we've mentioned there are available in like graphic novel form and stuff, and collected forms, like the Enemy Ace and some, the Jack Kirby stuff and things like that, and your EC books there that are those volumes. And so, we hope that this book will encourage people to go and find those other sources that we have used and read them and get them. It's good stuff.
Richard, did you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to add that one of our chapters is where can we find this stuff? So you might want to take a look at that too.
Yeah. And we have a list in there of our favorite stories too. So
right, and we couldn't decide on which ones were which, so he did one and I did one. So
yeah, we had to narrow it down too. We could have made the list.
And surprisingly, we didn't have that many crossovers, which is a good thing.
Yeah, that's right.
But probably between me and Richard, we have cornered the market on war comics history.
Yes.
We hope. I will say, there are other books that are like, Roy Thomas has done some books like Wonder Woman in, World War II, or Batman or Superman, but those are such a narrow focus. This book is, the first one to really expand, and cover more, of the war comic subject.
Yes. Now also, and again, Steve, thank you very much. And I want to thank Drew, the co-host of Comics for Fun and Profit, for putting this episode together. Drew, thank you very much for all your hard work behind the scenes. And if you are a new listener, please check out new episodes of Comics for Fun and Profit that comes out every Saturday. And I want to thank you, the listener. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you for listening to this episode. Until next time, guys, aloha.
Oh, aloha. Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Drew.
Yes, thank both of you. Appreciate it very much.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much.
Hey, bye-bye.
Bye.